Hi booktube, Aaron here, hope you're doing very well. Today I'm just going to give you a bit of an update on what I've been reading recently since the beginning of May. It's been one of those months that's just gone by really quickly. April felt like quite a long month, and yet it did also go quickly. It was that weird sort of contradiction, that strange paradox. Whereas May has just gone in a flash. There have been no delusions that it's been a long month. Yeah, I mean, we're only halfway through, but if it, like my brain hasn't caught up with the fact that it is May yet, so we'll see how it goes. But my reading has been fine, and I've been reading plenty since the beginning of May. There are a couple of books that I've finished that I won't be talking about in this video because I want to make a separate video for them. And that's because I want to make a wrap up for maybe Midrash, which is an event in May that's focused on readings around religion. Typically you read a work of fiction and a work of non-fiction, and I've read kind of one of each for this year, and so I'll be saving them for a separate video, hopefully in a week or so's time. But those books are Paradise Lost by John Milton, which I'm very glad to have read, and it's certainly not the last time that I'll be reading it. And also C.G. Jung's Answer to Job, which, until something else in this reading update, I was saying was one of the weirdest things I've ever read, but I think it's been beaten, and I read them both in the same week, so yeah, we'll get to that. So on to books that I do want to talk about today. So the first one is a book that I started, I think, towards the end of April and finished off right at the beginning of May, and that's Natashas Dance by Orlando Figes. It's a cultural history of Russia, and it's just amazing. It's one of my favourite things that I've read so far this year. In a way, it kind of reads almost like a novel. Very the prose, the whole style of it is relatively simple, but not in that way that sometimes when there's a sort of simplicity to language that it's almost condescending in its simplicity, because it's sort of assuming that you wouldn't be able to understand it if it was written any other way. Or sometimes I feel that maybe that's just my own insecurity, I don't know. But yeah, wonderfully written. And then just the subject matter itself. It's a really intriguing way to get the history of Russia, I suppose. He's written another more of a general history of Russia. This is really looking at how historically Russians have seen themselves and sort of seen their place in the world, and it's really intriguing, the relationship between Russia and Europe, that very uneasy relationship, and it begins with the founding of St. Petersburg, and the idea of a European Russia, with Peter the Great wanting to sort of mould a Russian identity that is looking towards Europe, looking to conform to it, but also even take European culture up a notch in a way and that's all sort of symbolised in the architecture and the planning of St. Petersburg. But it's also something that's, I suppose, not quite a sham. It's not quite the right word, but in some way, this whole thing, this Europeanization of Russia, you could maybe describe as the first Russian revolution, and then there's sort of a series of revolutions and counter-revolutions. That's not necessarily how Figes frames it in the book, but it was something that sort of came to me through his sort of explanation of the various changes over time. And so there's this very artificial Europeanization of Russia. Then he moves on to Moscow and to the more eastern Russian identity, and the way that, particularly after the burning of Moscow, after Napoleon's invasion and the rebuilding, there's this kind of playing up of the sort of Oriental side of Russian culture, with all the onion domes and everything all exaggerated, and that was when I can't remember the church, but there's a church or a cathedral in St. Petersburg that's, at least at the time of building, was like the only sort of typically Russian looking building, and it was sort of one of the newest ones because it was built in this new wave of a sort of new Russification of Russian culture. And then there's this move through to a kind of Slavic nationalism, I suppose, trying to get to the roots of that, and that's almost going hand in hand with an interest in the peasantry, in the serfs, and maybe they're more genuine. And so there's a whole section of the book that's probing this relationship between the Russian aristocracy and its serfs, and and again, there's always this element of it being not completely genuine, or trying to think of the right word, but something's being transposed onto the onto whatever the subject is, whether it's the city of St. Petersburg or onto the peasantry, or onto whatever. It's more someone's idea of what something is rather than the genuine thing. And then moving through to the late 19th century, very early 20th century, where anthropologists, artists, people like Vasily Kandinsky are probing more and more into sort of the more nomadic peoples living out east and north in Russia, and going deeper into Russia's sort of shamanic roots, and potentially what a more genuine early Russia might have been like. And that's met with a certain amount of controversy from the more Slavic nationalists. So there's a bit of a tension there. And then we have the Russian Revolution. There's a brilliant section where essentially Anna Akhmatova is used as a sort of central figure for the sort of pre-revolutionary period, and then you're sort of checking in with her as the revolution is happening, and then World War II, and then the Stalinist period, and yeah, her life. There are many other great. There's also the name is slipping out of my head. Something Svatayeva. I can't remember her first name, but another great Russian poet. Her life is used to as an example of the sort of emigre experience, as is Nabokov and people like that. And so there's that idea of the people who have been cut off from their country who are still there, and the people who've been cut off from their country who have had to leave. And it's just really wonderful. That's a sort of rough sketch of the ground covered by the book, and the groundwork is done through really looking at the lives and the interests of, I suppose, cultural people. So musicians, painters, and invaluably writers, whether they're historians or philosophers or poets or novelists. So we've got got Tolstoy in here. There's actually a wonderful section on Dostoevsky that was just brilliant, and got into some complexities about Dostoevsky that I hadn't really thought of before. I'll see if I can find it for you. Okay, so it's sort of getting into some of the darker elements of the brothers Karamazov. So let's see. So there's an incident that is cited by Ivan, the rationalist philosopher among the three Karamazov brothers, to explain to Alyosha, his younger brother and a novice at the monastery, why he cannot believe in the existence of God if his truth entails the suffering of little innocents. And it quotes from the book, "I say beforehand that the entire truth is not worth such a price. I do not want a mother to embrace the torturer who had her child torn to pieces by his dogs. Is there in the whole world a being who could or would have the right to forgive? I don't want harmony. I don't want harmony out of a love for mankind. I don't want it." In a letter to a friend, Dostoevsky said that Ivan's argument was irrefutable. In terms of moral feeling, it was unacceptable to leave such torture unavenged, and even Alyosha, who tries to follow Christ's example of forgiveness, agrees with Ivan that the general should be shot. Here was the fundamental question which Dostoevsky posed, not just in his novel, but in all his life and art. How could one believe in God when the world was created by him? When the world created by him was so full of suffering? It was such a question he was bound to ask when he looked at the society in which he lived. How could God have made Russia? And so before that point, he's given you Dostoevsky's backstory about his more radical sort of youth and early period, and then his arrest, his mock death sentence, or the last minute. I was going to say when he's sort of saved at the last minute, but saved isn't really the right word. And then he's taken off to a prison colony in Siberia. I can't remember how long, but for a significant amount of time. And so he does understand suffering, and just that sentence at the end, in the context of his life and in the context of his writing, how could God have made Russia? And it is a brutal place, and you know, in chapters before, dealing with earlier periods, there's horrible stuff going on, and you know, as a reader who has a rough idea of history, you know there's even worse to come, and so it just felt like a very poignant moment in the book. So I'd recommend it. It's just wonderful, but yeah, it's a lot to wrap your head around, and there's plenty more that Orlando Figes has written, so I'm sure I'll be getting to a little more of him at some point. The next book, and I'm looking at it, seems like I've been reading a lot of non-fiction this month, which I don't think was planned, but it does feel like this year has been relatively non-fiction heavy compared to other years. This book is called How They Broke Britain by James O'Brien. James O'Brien is a radio presenter. He sort of started out as a journalist, and then ended up on a sort of call-in radio show where they talk about current affairs in politics and the news and stuff. And yeah, I was sort of turned on to his radio show by Joe Spivey a few months ago, and have found it really, really valuable. I think the format of it is really helpful, and just people just talking through whatever's going on in the world, and so I've been enjoying that, and I've been sort of slowly gathering a picture of what O'Brien's sort of political outlook is, and you probably put him in as a sort of centrist uh, liberal, but with, I suppose, a lot of sympathy for more left-leaning figures, and I'd probably put myself in a similar position, I think. And so, yeah, I wanted to see what this was like. This is essentially about how the sort of the political climate in Britain has changed over the last decade, 15 years or so. The big elephant in the room in this book, I say elephant in the room, it is mentioned, the sort of central elements, not elephants, is Brexit, is the UK's referendum to leave the European Union back in 2016, and it's sort of how that could have happened. So the whole change in the media and in politics leading up to that, that just made that whole situation possible, and then the sort of fallout afterwards, and yeah, what things have been like, and what that whole process has turned British politics into. It sort of made a world where Boris Johnson and Liz Truss could be prime minister, much to the detriment of our country, as I would think, and as O'Brien thinks. And it's essentially the idea of the book is each chapter is a particular figure who he feels has played a significant role in this change in British politics and British culture and the media. And so some of them is, through actively things they've done and the part they've played. In others, it's maybe slightly more through negligence to a certain point. The sort of surprise in here was seeing Jeremy Corbyn in there, and I think it's sort of definitely, on the whole, it's definitely, negligence on the whole that's put Jeremy Corbyn in the book, among a couple of other things. And so it's going through such lovely people as Rupert Murdoch and Andrew Neil and Nigel Farage, and then we have David Cameron, Dominic Cummings, and then we've got Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and then there's a brief. Actually, I did find it funny that Liz Truss's chapter was really, really short, just like a premiership. And then we have an afterword reflecting on Rishi Sunak's time as Prime Minister, and that was the new material on the latest disasters as advertised on the front. And on the whole, for me, it was just a useful way to sort of reflect on a lot of the stuff I'd been kind of tuning out, particularly post-Brexit, I think, and certainly post-COVID. I don't know how much to ramble on about politics. I'm sure a lot of you don't live in the UK, so maybe don't find it quite so interesting. But essentially, I like to joke that every single general election and every sort of vote I've voted in has gone terribly wrong. I remember saying it to my dad, and he was like, "Yeah, me too," and I'm like twice your age. So I think that's just a lesson that you have to learn quite early on. But essentially, I had, my first vote. The Conservatives got in, and they were, they were already in, but they stayed in, and they were freed of the shackles of a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and so they could do their own thing, and it created a situation where Brexit was possible. And then we had the Brexit referendum, in which I voted to stay, and indeed my constituency, the place where I voted, I was within, that was the sort of consensus of where I was, but most of the places didn't, or just over half of other places didn't, and then it goes on from there. And I think it was during COVID, certainly in the lead up to COVID, after Theresa May, sort of stepped down as Prime Minister, and when Boris Johnson won his general election in 2019, I think it was, and I just felt there was something weird in the air, and didn't watch too much of the news. I wasn't super engaged, and so I couldn't exactly work out what it was that didn't feel right to me. And then Brexit happened. Not Brexit, sorry. And then COVID happened, and again, there were all the scandals going out. But again, just in terms of the response, and in terms of the words I was hearing in the messages from the government, and in the way everything was being handled, I felt like there was a mismatch there. But again, couldn't put my finger on it. And after a while, after about a year of logging into Facebook just to look at the statistics that Facebook were providing at that time of the number of cases and the number of deaths, I sort of turned off, I suppose, from the news and from anything like that, and so I just stopped thinking about it. And now a few years have gone by, and I'm not going overboard, but I am trying to get a little more engaged in understanding things. And essentially this reminded me of things that were going on, that were little signals to me at certain points that things were a bit weird, and I couldn't tell why. And again, just providing a little more context and putting various things together. And it just made things make a little more sense. So apologies for the ramble, but that was the only way I could really talk about the book, and I haven't really talked about the book, but I liked it. But again, I'm not. This is where the slightly more skeptical part of my brain comes out. With a book like this, it's probably only going to be people like me, people who largely agree with O'Brien on 90% of things, that are going to enjoy reading it. So maybe it will, persuade some people. Maybe other people will find it interesting and enjoy reading it despite disagreeing with it. I'm not sure, but there is a little part of me that just wonders, what is this book for? What is it going to do? What is it going to accomplish? I don't know, but I liked it, and I found it useful to a certain degree. And then the next book I'll talk about, and I'll talk about quickly. I don't really know how much I have to say about it, but this is the book that's the weird. It's one of the weirdest books I've read, and it's The Discomfort of Evening by Lucas Rijneveld, and it's just really odd. A weird mix of disturbing and what would the other word be? Sort of lovableness to the main character. It's about a family who live on a dairy farm in the Netherlands. They're a very conservative family. They're deeply enrooted in the Dutch Reformed Church, which seem quite intense. They have the element that stands out to me is that the elders of the church come round to each home midweek to make sure that they've understood the sermon correctly at church the previous Sunday. So intense in that respect. And it's about the family dynamics really, and how they change, and particularly how everything reflects on our main character. And I was expecting the parents to be very overbearing. I think I've read out the first paragraph or so before, which is describing, it's describing the mother covering each of the children one by one in udder cream that they usually use on the cows. Um, and so I was expecting the parents to be quite overbearing, and there are some weird boundaries that sometimes the parents cross that doesn't feel natural, shall we say, and but on the whole, they're more neglectful than they are overbearing, and certainly that becomes more and more the case when about 30 pages into the book. So it's not really too much of a spoiler. But one of the kids in the family, I think the eldest son, dies unexpectedly in an accident, and then really the rest of the book is about how grief affects the family, and particularly how it affects the main character, who is called Yaz, Jas, and it's about how, I think in a way she's grieving without realizing that she's grieving. She won't cry, and she feels like she has to hold on to everything, which one of the weird, is full of these really intense, lurid details, particularly about the body, and so there are certainly quite a number of skin crawling kind of moments. But part of that not wanting to get rid of anything is quite a profound case of constipation, and her father's sort of relief, his household cure for that is invasive, to say the least. I think I'll just leave that there. And it is, it's a really odd book. The voice of the character is really compelling. There is something really urgent and lovable to her, even if it's clear to see from very early on the book. I think even before, even before the tragedy and all the grief comes in, that she has stuff going on that needs to be dealt with, and if the parents, who probably were struggling and were maybe unconsciously fighting their own battles even before their son had died, they just don't notice any of this in their daughter, I don't think. And I think that's part of the problem, is this element of not caring. And I don't really know what else to say about the book. That sort of structurally and things, it, at least for me, made me want a little bit more. I felt like the ending was relatively sudden and could have been built up a little bit more. It felt a little lackluster to me, a little too. And I'm going to do this to end the book, and then it ends. And a little bit with the tragedy, with the with the death of the eldest son, which is an echo of Exodus. It's a plague on Egypt, and some of the characters think that things that are happening to them as a family are manifestations of some of the other plagues, and Bible verses are quoted frequently throughout the book, often in really strange contexts, which is entertaining to a certain extent. But with what I was saying with the eldest son, when he dies, I feel like it happened too soon in the book, not quite far enough in for you to have got an idea of what he was like, what he meant to the family, and what he means to you as a reader. You're not invested yet when he dies, and I think that was just what the author was thinking. You know, I think it was that the focus of the book was supposed to be trauma and grief, and that the author wanted it to be an examination of that, of how it plays out mentally and physically, and so maybe almost a little automatically it had to be quite soon in the book. But I think it could have been a little later and had a little more weight to it emotionally. Um, and yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. I sort of had a middling reaction to the book. The writing itself was wonderful. There are certain details in there that, yeah, it does make you feel uncomfortable. It's supposed to, but again, um, I'm not entirely sure what to think of it. So, The Discomfort of Evening, hard to recommend because everyone's coming at it from a different place. And that's it. That's what I've finished so far this month. I'm currently making my way through the selected poems of Randall Jarrell, and I've also just started reading on the natural history of destruction by W.G. Sebald. And actually, both of these have sort of tied up quite nicely, in that this is all about the Allied bombings on Germany and really the I suppose the effect, or I don't know, the sort of silence around that on the sort of German side, that how no one really talked about it for a long time. And in Randall Jarrell, I've just got to a section of poems that are all about the Second World War, and a section of poems about gunners and about the Air Force, and on people who are working on these bomber planes, saying that they're killing people that they never see, and so I'm sort of seeing different sides of it, and it's just always intriguing when different elements of your reading sort of marry up in that way. And I'm still making my very slow way through the Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton. The last bit I read was about essentially if, and it's amazing to see how medical science has moved on since this came out. But it's a conjecture on the point on if a certain malady is whether the cause of it, if the cause of a malady is an evil spirit or witchcraft or something like that. The thing the motion he's pushing is whether it's permissible to use the same means to cure it. So whether you can use, white magic to heal what black magic has done, and things like that. So yeah, I'm just sort of glad that I don't live when he was alive. So yeah, it's always intriguing to see what people thought of, and his arguments, and sort of the images he uses as he's exploring these questions are always very interesting, and it is, yeah, it is entertaining in its own strange way. So there we go. That's my rather non-fiction heavy reading update. I hope that your month has been going well, and I'm sure I'll be back soon. So for now, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.